Chapter 9. Hazard. Hazard looked out at the crescent-shaped beach, fringed with palm trees. The South China Sea was a perfect Tiffany blue, the sky cloudless. If he'd seen this on Instagram, he'd assume it'd been photoshopped and filtered. But after 3 weeks here, all this perfection was starting to get on his nerves. During his morning walk along the beach, before the sand became too hot to walk barefoot, he'd found himself longing to find a dog turd lying on the white, powdery sand. Anything to break up the monotonous beauty. Hazard often felt the urge to shout for help, but he knew that this beach was like deep space. No one could hear you scream. Hazard had been to this island before, 5 years ago. He'd been staying on Ga Samui with some friends, and they'd taken the boat over for a couple of days. It was too far off grid for him, and he'd been keen to get back to the bars, clubs, and full moon parties of Samui, not to mention reliable electricity, hot water, and Wi-Fi. But hidden among the endless, grubby, and sordid flashbacks of one-night stands, drunken inappropriate texting, and rendezvous with dodgy dealers in dark alleyways, the memory of this place shimmered like an oasis of tranquility in the inhospitable desert of his recent history. So when he finally made the decision to clean up his act and sort his life out, he booked a one-way ticket out here. Surely this island was too far away from anything for him to get into any trouble, and cheap enough for him to be able to survive for months if necessary on his last city bonus. At one end of the small beach was a cafe, Lucky Mother, and at the other end, a bar called Monkey Nuts, after their only bar snack. Strung between the two, like a row of pearls, but without the sheen, were 25 huts, erected among the palm trees overlooking the sea. Number 8 belonged to Hazard. It was a simple wooden structure, not much bigger than his father's garden shed. There was a bedroom, almost entirely filled with a double bed, draped in a large mosquito net riddled with holes large enough to admit whole coach parties of hungry insects. A small bathroom with a loo and a cold water shower was tacked onto one side, like an escape pod clutching onto the mothership. The windows were little more than hatches, lined with more mosquito netting. The only other furniture was a bedside table made from an old Tiger beer crate, a single bookshelf housing a motley and eclectic collection of books bequeathed to Hazard by travelers who were moving on, and a few hooks on which Hazard hung the assortment of sarongs he'd picked up in town. He wondered what his old mates would think of him parading around all day in nothing but a skirt. Hazard was swaying gently in a hammock hanging between two supports at either end of the wooden deck that ran the length of his hut. He watched a small motorboat moor up on the beach, collecting the 15 or so day trippers from Samui, leaving only the residents behind. The sky was turning stunning shades of red and orange as the sun dipped to the horizon. Hazard knew that in a matter of minutes it would be dark. Out here, so close to the equator, the sun made a hasty exit. There were none of the drawn-out, showy, and teasing goodbyes he was used to back home. It was more like lights out in the dorm at boarding school. He could hear the Lucky Mother generator crank up, and he caught the faintest whiff of petrol along with the sound of Andy and Barbara, a westernized approximation of their Thai names, Hazard assumed, getting ready to produce the evening meal. It had been 23 days since Hazard had last had a drink or a drug. He was certain about this, because he'd been carving a tally on the wooden base of his bed, like a prisoner of Alcatraz rather than a tourist in one of the most beautiful corners of the earth. That morning, he counted 4 little batches of 5 and 3 extras. They had been long days, punctuated by waves of headaches, sweating, and shivering, and nights of the most vivid dreams during which he relived his wildest excesses. Just last night, he dreamed he was snorting a line of coke off Barbara's taut, tanned belly. He could barely look at her at breakfast. Hazard was, however, starting to feel better, at least physically. The fog and tiredness had begun to recede, but they had been replaced by a tsunami of emotions. Those pesky feelings of guilt, regret, fear, boredom, and dread that he'd always magicked away with a shot of vodka or line of coke. He was haunted by memories of secrets spilled for the sake of good anecdote, of girlfriends betrayed for a quickie in a nightclub toilet cubicle, of disastrous trades made off the back of a chemical sense of invulnerability. And oddly, in the middle of all this horrible introspection, he'd often find himself thinking about the stories in that green notebook. He had visions of Mary trying to ignore Julian's models, Julian shredding his canvases in the middle of the night, Tanya splattered over the pavement, and Monica handing out muffins and dreaming of love. When he turned up at Monica's cafe to return the notebook, Hazard had realized, to his horror, that Monica was the same woman he'd collided with the night before he'd resigned from his job and turned his back on all remnants of his previous life. He'd backed out quickly before she spotted him, so he still had the notebook, and the longer he held on to it, the more the secrets it held lodged in his brain and refused to budge. He wondered if Monica had managed to persuade Julian to teach her art class, and what sort of bloke would be right for her. The sound of a bell ringing traveled along the beach. 7 p.m. Time for supper. Lucky Mother served just one evening meal. It was the only place in walking distance to eat, and you ate what you were given. After decades of endless choice, of every decision having subsections, tea or coffee, cappuccino, Americano, latte, regular milk, skimmed, or soya, Hazard found the lack of options curiously refreshing. The open-sided restaurant, with its wooden floor and thatched roof, was laid out with one large table stretching its whole length. There were a few smaller tables dotted around too, but new visitors worked out pretty quickly that the accepted thing to do was join the group at the communal table, unless you wanted everyone to look at you suspiciously, wondering what you had to hide. As Hazard watched the other residents of his beach walking toward Lucky Mother, he had an idea. So many of the people he'd meet here were from London or had a visit planned on their itinerary. He could check them all out and find a boyfriend for Monica. He did know a fair bit about her, after all. More than he ever bothered to find out about most of his girlfriends. He could be like her fairy godmother, her secret matchmaker. It'd be fun. Or at least it'd be something to do. Hazard took a seat at the cafe and, feeling re-energized by his new mission, surreptitiously checked out the other guests. As far as he could tell, he was now about the fourth longest standing resident. Most people stayed no longer than 5 days or so. Neil, Hazard's neighbor at number 9, had been here the longest, nearly a year. He had invented some sort of app which he'd sold to a big tech company, and ever since then, he'd been indulging his inner hippie. He tried to teach Hazard to meditate, perhaps sensing his inner turmoil, but Hazard had been unable to clear his mind from thinking about Neil's feet, which were covered in yellowing dead skin, his toenails thick and crusty like hooves. This put Neil out of the running in Hazard's new game. However desperate Monica was, those feet wouldn't wash. Actually, he thought, a wash was exactly what Neil needed. Monica struck him as someone rather hot on personal hygiene. Rita and Daphne were the two other relatively long-timers, both retired, one widowed, one never married, both ferocious sticklers for good manners. Hazard watched Rita glare at one of the guests who'd reached rudely across her for the water jug. They each had their own hut. Daphne, in theory, lived at number 7, but Hazard, who had become an early riser, had only ever seen her entering her hut in the morning, rather than leaving it, leading him to suspect they were enjoying a sapphic fling in the autumn of their years. And why the hell not? Andy laid a dish containing a large baked fish, big enough to share among 3 or 4 of them, in front of Hazard with a flourish. Hazard's practiced eyes scanned down the long table, discounting all the couples in various stages of loved-upness, and any men under the age of 30. Even if one of them were open-minded enough to cop off with an older woman, they weren't likely to be ready for the whole procreation thing, which was for Monica a bit of a deal-breaker. Hazard's glance snagged momentarily on 2 California girls. They were, he guessed, no older than 25 and had that peachy, innocent, box-fresh glow about them. Hazard wondered, idly, if he should make a play for one of them. Maybe both. But he didn't think he was ready to try to have sex without the false confidence of a drink or a line to chivvy him along. Hazard hadn't, now he thought about it, had sex since Blanche. Actually, he hadn't had sex sober since. He rewound his memory back further and further before settling on forever. The idea was terrifying. How was it possible to be so present during something so intimate and revealing? Surely all that squelching and thrusting and groaning and sometimes even farting would just be deeply embarrassing without the numbing effect of narcotics. Perhaps he'd never have sex again. The thought was, strangely, almost less terrifying than the thought of never having a drink or a drug again. And that one he'd already been contemplating for weeks. Hazard turned to the Swede on his left, offering his hand. He looked like a good place to start. Hi, you must be new here. I'm Hazard. Gunther, he replied, with a smile that displayed some impressive Scandinavian dentistry. Where are you from? Where are you going? Hazard employed the standard opening gambit on the island, a bit like discussing the weather back home. No point in discussing the weather here, since it was invariably the same. I'm from Stockholm, on my way to Bangkok, Hong Kong, then London. You? Hazard gave himself a mental high five at the mention of London. This could work. I'm from London, just out here for a few weeks while I'm between jobs, he replied. Hazard chatted to Gunther on autopilot as he ate his fish. He was finding it difficult to concentrate on the conversation as he was mesmerized by Gunther's ice-cold beer. Condensation dripped down the side of the glass bottle. Hazard worried that if he didn't find some other distraction, he might just wrestle the beer from him and down it. Do you play backgammon? He asked as soon as they'd finished eating. Sure, replied Gunther. Hazard walked over to one of the tables in the corner, which was inlaid with a chessboard on one side and a backgammon board on the other. So what do you do back home, Gunther? Asked Hazard as they set up the pieces. I'm a teacher, he replied. What about you? This, thought Hazard, was extremely good news. An easily transferable skill. Good with children, and, he noted looking at Gunther's large hands with clean, nicely trimmed fingernails. Acceptable levels of grooming. I was a banker, Hazard replied. Equity trader. But I'll be looking for a new career when I get home. Gunther threw a 6 and a 1. Hazard waited for him to make the classic blocking move. He missed it. What an amateur. This would, for Hazard, be a red line. He quickly reminded himself that he was not looking at Gunther as a life partner for himself, and that Monica was, presumably, less fussy when it came to the ability to play a good game of backgammon. Do you have a wife back home, Gunther? Asked Hazard, cutting to the chase. He noticed the wedding ring, but it was always sensible to double-check. Not wife, girlfriend. But how do you say in English? What goes on tour stays on tour, right? He nodded conspiratorially over at the 2 California girls. Hazard felt his mood deflate like a popped balloon. Impressive use of English idiom, perhaps, but terribly loose morals. Gunther, he concluded, with a sense of paternalistic protectionism that surprised him, just wasn't going to make the grade. Monica deserved better. Now, how quickly could he wipe this board clear of all Gunther's pieces and go to bed? When Hazard got back to number 8, clutching an oil-fired hurricane lamp, since the generator was now off for the night, He found he wasn't tired. He didn't, however, want to join the crowd at Monkey Nuts. The idea of watching other people drink alcohol while he sipped a Diet Coke was just too exhausting. He looked at the books on his bookshelf. He'd read them all at least once, apart from the Barbara Cartland that Daphne had given him. He tried the first chapter in desperation yesterday, but it had made his eyeballs bleed. Then he spotted Julian's little notebook poking out, as if begging to be picked up. Hazard took it off the shelf, picked up a biro, turned to the first clean page, and began to write.